You're listening to Politics Unspun with me, Jack McCluskey.
And me, Charlie Carter.
We're two economists discussing the hottest political debates.
Like, do tax cuts really boost economic growth?
How high should the minimum wage be?
Is Scotland ready for independence?
Should post-work pints be free?
Yes. And because there's nothing we love more than the sound of our own voices, we're putting our future career prospects on the line to share our thoughts on each one of these deliciously controversial topics.
We hope you enjoy.
Hey, Jack.
Hey, you're right.
How's life?
It's going really well. Just recovered from an illness, so I'm feeling ready to go. What about you?
Physically exhausted, bad outlook on things, and just really don't want to be here.
Anyway, what are we talking about today, Charlie?
Yeah, so in this podcast, Jack, we're going to sort of take a little bit of a step back from our usual looking into the detail of policy and really take a step back and actually look into the politics and try and explain to you the intricacies of different political ideologies. So we're going to try explain the difference between different political ideologies and explain how they underpin the modern landscape. So in this, we're going to sort of be discussing the idea of liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and then take it to the extreme fascism. And these are all very nuanced, complex political ideologies that we're going to try explain in my very amateurish style. So yeah.
It doesn't sound amateurish based on the little things you've sort of told me already. So I'm quite excited to hear your opinions.
I'm an economist by training. This is very much something out of interest that I like to study on the side. But I think it's really interesting how it relates to policy, politics, and obviously, during the 24 election cycle, we've seen so many political pundits misunderstand these terms. And I sort of want to do this because it looks at the macro of politics a little bit more. And we're going to try do this in an objective way. And we're going to try and understand what are the intellectual threads that connect British politics to those parties across the pond or the channel, and then try to sort of spread that out and explain the intellectual foundations behind the broader conflict between Western liberal democracies and illiberal dictatorships in the East. And I think to really have a nuanced understanding of that, I think you've sort of got to understand the differences between these ideologies. And it's going to be different. It's going to be fun. It sort of means we don't talk about the IFS for an episode. So
yeah, there's quite the responsibility on our hands here to educate the masses on. You seem to say it's underpinning everything.
And yeah, there's a huge list of different ideologies. And so for the purpose of this podcast, because I don't want to dedicate a whole weekend to talking into this microphone, no matter how pretty and colourful it might be, we're not going to talk about a few different isms. So we're not going to talk about nationalism, populism, religious fundamentalism, anarchism, feminism, environmentalism, separatism, or transhumanism, which I found this when I was doing this. And this advocates for using technology to enhance human abilities and improve the human condition, often focused on issues like life extension and artificial intelligence. So I guess just Elon Musk encapsulated.
Yeah, it sounded like a plot from Avengers, that.
Right. Oh, mate, you sold it to me. Everyone Iron Man outfits. Yeah, so yeah, we're not going to be talking about transhumanism. Don't worry. I'm not trying to scare the listener.
I know you want to start on the sort of liberalism side of things, right? Because you say it underpins everything.
Yeah. So I think we should probably start on the liberalism aspect, because it, like you say, it does sort of underpin the Western philosophical approach for the last 300 years. Just before we get onto that, I think it's important to sort of clarify the fact that a lot of people think about the political axis as a left versus right. And this originates from the French Revolution. Those who sat on the left of the house were very anti-monarchy, and those that sat on the right of the house were very pro-monarchy. And this is left versus right is essentially the extent to which you believe that social hierarchy should be maintained. And that's one way of thinking about the left versus right axis. But I also want to add to that sort of y-axis on this political sort of graph. And the right up and down axis, the y-axis, is essentially going to be the extent to which you believe in the rule of government. How much do you believe that the individual is sovereign as opposed to we should focus on society? And how powerful should the state be in maintaining social order? And I think that's going to give a little bit more nuance to just that traditional left versus right, which doesn't often encapsulate.
So is this what the sort of political compass you see on that quiz that, I don't know your opinions on it, but I don't think it's a particularly good quiz, but
yeah.
But when you look up the political compass where you do this little test and it pings out a little dot on an axis, right? And it tells you where you sit. So I believe they've got it, the labels are, was it authoritarian and libertarian as the two sides of that coin, right?
Yeah. So libertarian, authoritarian. So that's just the y-axis, how much you believe the government should be involved in our lives, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then left versus right, like you said. Did you ever do one of those? Do you know where it put you, out of interest?
I do them really regularly, despite
do you?
despising that that quiz. I like to just see if I change through my life, and I sort of do, but I normally come out as libertarian and then slightly centre left, I think. But
Okay.
I mean, one of the reasons I don't enjoy that quiz is I find that a lot of the questions are fairly
biased.
I don't know. It's hard to interpret them in a right-wing way. It sort of pushes you down unless you're a complete monster or like hyper-conservative, especially if you're religious.
Yeah.
That would plop you out on the sort of the right-handed spectrum. But
I agree
it seems like unless you're extreme, it wasn't going to tell you were right-wing, which I think it's a little bit maybe biased in that way.
When I was bored over my summer between A-level and university, when I started university, I played this game called Democracy 3, where essentially you run a little country and you play different little policies, whatever. And if you play this game, it puts you on a political axis depending on your policies. And no matter how you played the game, it put you on a libertarian left wing. So I tried to test it. I tried to test this once. And so I was like, screw it. We are just going to like death penalty, flags on every corner, compulsory military service, public execution, whatever. And it would put me at like mildly authoritarian. I was like, it was just impossible to become authoritarian on that game. And I feel that's sort of similar with the political compass, right?
It is, because I've done a similar thing where I did try and plot myself out as right wing. I don't know, one day I decided, maybe I might be that side. So I'll try, see it in that angle. Every question I would interpret that way. And I still could barely move the dial, and I barely moved it. And I was genuinely picking some stuff like, what was it? People who have hereditary illnesses and things, that they shouldn't be allowed to have kids and stuff. I clicked, even that sort of stuff I was clicking on. I still came out as like,
and you came out as like a Lib Dem.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, what? It was really confusing, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Maybe that's why we should just end the episode there. Just Jack's in favour of eugenics.
I'm glad that I'm doing the editing and not you, because otherwise you could really do me dirty.
No, I know. We're keeping this. You've done me dirty a few times. We're keeping this. Let's just hope no question about blonde hair, blue eyes comes up. Anyway, we'll get to your ideology at the end. But yeah, okay, so I was just going to sort of run us through liberalism, because like you said, Jack, I mean, liberalism is the foundation of the modern liberal democracy. And there's so much misinterpretation about the word liberalism. You've got libertarians, you've got social liberals, you've got classical liberals, and they all sort of stand for very different things, but there are common intellectual threads that combine them. So I just sort of wanted to explain this idea of liberalism and sort of see how we get on. So liberalism has essentially flourished from the Enlightenment period of the 17th and 18th century in Western Europe. And this was at a time as the notion of the divine right of kings and European monarchs began to fracture. So this belief in the sort of strong monarch sort of began to fray and fracture at the seams through the works of some political philosophers. And liberalism sort of formed as this intellectual belief that was characterized by the belief in the sovereign individual. So it put a premium on the importance of maintaining individual liberty, and it differs much more from socially orientated ideologies like socialism or to the extreme fascism. And naturally, this sort of relies on this underlying belief that individuals are rational and that they know their needs best and can act on them better than anyone else can. So basically this idea that the state shouldn't be particularly strong, it should only be there to preserve life, liberty, and property. And this idea that the state should not get involved in people's lives, and the goal of any social or economic system should be to preserve the freedom and liberty of individuals. And that's really what libertarianism stands for. And as you can see, that just underpins Western democracies to a T. And I think John Stuart Mill, a really, really, really intelligent bloke from the 18th century, I believe, basically encapsulated liberalism by saying human beings should be free to express opinions without reserve. A novel idea for the time. But that is the whole premise of liberalism. So yeah. Okay.
So there are two terms there that seem fairly similar, but I don't know if there are a difference or not. So liberalism and libertarianism. So where's the sort of distinguishing line there?
Okay. So libertarianism, this is where we get into sort of the nuance of liberalism. Liberalism is this sort of umbrella term that encapsulates different types. And the only thing that connects all of these types is this underlying belief in liberty. But intellectually, there are different methodologies and approaches to what liberty is, right? So classical liberals, which were the ones who emerged out of the Enlightenment, essentially said that the state should not be involved in people's social lives. So we should not be involved in monitoring them. They said that everyone was equal in the eyes of the law. They were very in favor of socially progressive policies for the time, which was sort of the equivalent, you don't have to wear a top hat in public if you don't want to. I guess that was the equivalent of socially progressive back then. And they essentially inherently believed there was no social hierarchy. And so they were strongly opposed to the monarchy at the time, who had absolute power, and that was this divine right of kings. So that was from the social element. And liberals all believe in that side of it. They all believe in a secular society. Religion doesn't influence government policy. And this was sort of captured by Tony Blair, wanted to end a press conference during the Iraq War with a reference to God. Alistair Campbell, his press secretary, famously responded, "We don't do God here." And that was that sort of liberal approach. But basically, the two differences between libertarianism, which is like that classical liberal who doesn't want a government, a very strong government, I should say, and a social liberal, is that a social liberal recognizes that market failures and free markets aren't perfect all of the time. They recognize there's frictions like imperfect information, monopoly power, externalities, all of these things that mean that you need some government regulation to be able to maintain liberty. Because if you had an unfettered free market, then that is naturally illiberal, because you will give power to people who don't necessarily deserve it. You will maintain social hierarchies in the form of institutions and nepotism. And so you need a government to be able to redistribute resources marginally and also have some controls over the game, and then allow the free market to operate within that. And this all sort of derives from John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which is really what truly differentiates liberals and social liberals. And it's this idea that people should be able to act in whatever they want as long as it doesn't harm someone else. And that's what sort of differentiates liberals from anarchists. Anarchists don't want any state, where classical liberals and social liberals want a state, but only to preserve life, liberty, and property, as famously quoted by John Locke in The Social Contract. And so they want things like a police force, military, and to be able to maintain enforceable property rights, but they don't want lots of government intervention. That's basically the difference between a social and classical liberal or libertarian.
So it's only a slight difference, but it has huge ramifications, right? Because I'm thinking, so the classically libertarians, basically freedom of speech is part of that, I imagine.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's got to be a big part. Whereas if you take it on the other side, people call the liberal elite, they're almost considered woke, I guess. Are they in that category? Sometimes, yes, I imagine. So people say, oh, the liberal elite won't let you say anything, they don't have the freedom of speech. And I guess that comes down to what you were saying about, was it freedom of action with no harm?
Exactly.
As long as you're not having an effect on other people. So it's interesting to see it. They're both seeing it about freedom, yet one is curbing freedoms, but to preserve freedom. And I find that a really interesting difference.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. You see this contrast in America massively. Like a libertarian and liberal are now in America considered on opposite ends of the political spectrum. Because a liberal in America is often given that sort of left-wing connotation. But in America, Kamala Harris said, just let us do what we want. That was one of her slogans at one point, was just get out of our lives. The Conservatives need to just get out of our lives. And that's not typically a left-wing position. So it's why it gets a little bit nuanced. But a liberal is someone that believes that we should be allowed to do what we want without harming other people. And that's why they regulate free markets a little bit more. And also that's why I think the social liberals have started to regulate free speech to a degree, but it's only regulating free speech so you don't incite violence. You can regulate free speech to be able to maintain freedom by restricting people's ability to incite violence. And that's really interesting and really highlighted in American politics as well.
Very interesting. I'm really scared about taking us on a tangent when clearly there's an order of what you want to talk about. But what I find interesting is the linkages or the complete differences between almost conservatism and libertarianism, that you'd normally consider them sort of on the same side of the political spectrum. Like you said, it's not as simple as just left and right wing, but you've got libertarians technically should be okay with abortion. Am I right about that? I'm starting losing my bearings a little bit.
No, exactly. So before, without preempting going on to conservatism, yes, a libertarian.
That's what I'm worried about, I'm sorry.
So a libertarian, this is what I mean, it gets confusing because this is why you need that libertarian authoritarian axis, because people that can be economically similar can vastly differ on social policy. A libertarian, by the true definition, is someone who doesn't want to intervene in social life. So they're very pro-drug legalization, they're very pro-abortion, they are very in favor of gay marriage and trans rights or gay rights, whatever. because they just don't care. They get out of people's lives. And that is sort of the most logically consistent position in some ways, because you are on the right wing economically, you just don't want the government involved in your life at all, and you also don't want them involved socially. Where a social liberal will say, yeah, stay out of my social life, stay out of my... There was one politician who said the government shouldn't be involved in the bedroom, sort of thing. That's a liberal position. But they will say, we recognize that to maintain levels of freedom, you do need some rules of the game. If you're playing chess and there's no rules, that's not freedom. And that's the position of social liberals. That you have to have the rules of the game for it to be free. And the methodology in which they approach freedom is very different. Where conservatives aren't interested in freedom, that's not their main objective. So that's where the ideological difference comes. And that pretty much encapsulates the difference between all of these different strands of liberalism, which gets incredibly confusing. But you've got to remember, in practice, almost all political parties in the Western world are considered liberal to some degree. It's the largest and most influential political ideology in human history. But you have to sort of remember that over the last few years, this sort of unfettered approach to social policy has hit a nerve with more religiously fundamental parts of the world, and also illiberal, tyrannies essentially in the East. And this has often led to a fall in democracy and belief in liberalism, and this sort of underlying intellectual belief that individuals are not as strong together as they are in a group. And we'll come on to that when we talk about more aggressive ideologies later on. But that's important to emphasize, that there is this sort of inherent conflict in the world between these liberal democracies versus these places that just fundamentally don't believe that liberalism is the way to go. And
that's quite a severe distinction between two sides. I mean, we've got two sides of political debate, but fundamentally still somewhat rooted in liberalism. And there are other places that genuinely that's not even the debate. Yeah, I mean,
you have the Liberal Democrats in the UK, right, who are essentially the most purely, I guess, socially liberal party. They embrace policy stances that encapsulate liberal values more so than other parties like election reform, voting rights for prisoners, and they have very pro-globalist values. But it doesn't mean that the Conservatives and the Labour are illiberal. They still very much found themselves in that liberal democracy, everyone is equal in the eyes of the law, those sort of principles. And so in Western world, you broadly do see that all these parties are basically liberal to a degree. They just vary slightly on different, they just add elements of other ideologies to their recipe.
I see. Right. So let me just try and summarize before we move on, just so I can just check it in my own head.
No.
That the Western world is mostly liberal, and that liberal is an umbrella term, and that the two sides that we normally hear about would be the libertarian side, which is very much get out of my life in all respects, and the socially liberal, or sorry, what's
social
the correct
liberal,
term? Social liberal, which is what you hear about when people talk about the liberal elite and things like that. That's more the left-leaning side, which is more, okay, to preserve our liberty and freedom, which is the underpinning of liberalism. We do need to have rules or get involved, intervene to maintain those freedoms. Am I right in that?
No,
Is that a good summary?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to make sure that all forms of liberalism believe in that you need a state to some degree. I think John Locke said, where the law ends, tyranny begins. And so all liberals are in favour. It's just that classical liberals or libertarians believe that you need a military, police, and that's it, basically. But social liberals will say, well, you need a well-educated workforce. You need maybe universal healthcare. You need other controls to manage. You need regulation for environmental agencies and those sort of things. So that's what differentiates it from anarchism. But also there's variance within liberalism as to how much you limit people's lives. Yeah. I hope that was clear, sort of. Yeah.
No, it is. I think it's a complex one, isn't it? And I think we've managed. So that's good.
I'll just end this section just by saying a quote I love from Voltaire, who is a French philosopher, I believe, and it sums it up, which is, Monsieur, I deteste, forgive the French accent, I
want to see it.
Monsieur, I detest what you write. Yeah, of course. I detest what you write, but I'd give my life to make it possible for you to continue to write. And I think that just encapsulates liberalism to a T.
Brilliant. I like that. So now we
can move on.
We can, right? We're finally moving on, but it's worth spending that time on the fundamental thing holding us all together.
That's apart from alcohol, mate. That's the fundamental thing holding me together. But yeah, okay. we can call it liberalism.
I'm convinced it's what's cured me of my illness. Maybe it's just shut down my immune system and the symptoms don't appear just because it's not even trying to save me anymore.
It's just given up. you don't have an immune system to react anymore.
Exactly. So the next is conservatism, right? Is that where we're going?
I'm just stretching out because I realised that we're in for the long haul, and my back's starting to hurt. Sorry,
Oh, you old man.
Okay, so when we're talking about conservatism, this is what basically encapsulates what is now considered in the modern world to encapsulate the difference between the left and the right wing, right? But as we see, there's some nuance with this. So if liberal values are about progression, and they're about free thought, and they're about the idea that free thought naturally leads to progression of society, and we can constantly, it's moral relativism of beliefs change, beliefs change, understanding changes, and the society progresses both socially and economically. If liberalism is progressivism, like liberals being called progressives, conservatives conserve tradition. They're not too focused on moving society forward as they are as maintaining traditional values. That's where the conserve comes from. So liberalism is inherently dynamic, where conservatism could be considered more static or trying to stay with old tradition. So a conservative in the 1100s is very different to a conservative now.
Yeah,
so
it depends on your reference point, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a much better way of putting it. Yeah, it depends on your reference point. So, and what conservatives now believe are essentially belief in traditional Enlightenment economic values and social values. Okay, so the economics of the 17th, 18th century combined with the social, religiously based social policy. So that tends to be why you get this intersection between libertarianism, where markets essentially completely free, but also social policy that and moral values that are stemming from old Christian text and beliefs. So on social policy in America, they're very pro-life, they're very pro the nuclear family, believe in a strong military, believe in compulsory military service to some degree. In America, they're very pro-gun, because they believe in the Constitution, which is obviously a conservative to conserve that belief in the Constitution. But they combine this with a belief in privatization, low taxes, government should stay out of your life, unregulated small state. And that's how they align with the classical libertarian view. But they differ from libertarians on their theocratic religious beliefs to a degree.
I see. So even though you'll see them on the same side of the political spectrum and almost near each other in that respect, if you didn't have that other axis we talked about and things, and you didn't see this, there is overlap, like you said, like especially with the economic stuff where we're saying leave markets alone. That's sort of a conservative sort of idea as well as libertarian, but in other ways they are fundamentally very different, yet they're on the same side. Given our political system, you can only vote in one party. You end up with one left wing dominating and one right wing party dominating. You pick between the two, so you end up fighting on the same side despite having some quite fundamentally different ideas.
And
right?
This is where their variance within political parties comes from to a degree. And I think this is where we start to see a misunderstanding in the political ideology from political pundits. So Ben Shapiro often quotes himself as a libertarian. He's not, because he has traditional social conservative values. He's a conservative. He's not a libertarian, because a libertarian wouldn't care about gay marriage. They wouldn't care about traditionally religious views, because they just don't care. They don't care about trans things. They don't care about that stuff. They don't care about social policy. They just want government to stay out of their lives. So Ben Shapiro misunderstands. He's not a libertarian. Similarly, I saw someone on LBC critiquing James Cleverly's military compulsory service. Sorry, the Conservatives' military service with James Cleverly. And he was saying, is it not a conservative thing to want freedom in your lives? And James Cleverly goes, no, that's not what a conservative is. It's never what we've claimed to be. Because a lot of what people assume the right wing is get out of my life, and they want the state to get out of their life. But that's not what it is. There's nuance to it. Conservatives are much more happy for the state to intervene in people's social lives and and that's where they differ. And that's where you see this fight within parties. And on that sort of divide within parties, there's sort of two different shades of conservatism. And I think this is where our old friend Rory Stewart sort of comes into the mix. We can talk a little bit about him. You have one nation conservatives, and you have what's considered the new right conservatives. And so the basic way of thinking about this is that new right conservatives are more right-wing and more authoritarian. So they believe that the government shouldn't be involved in the economy as much. They believe in much more in privatization, low taxes, all that stuff, much more than centrist, moderate, one nation conservatives. So these sort of people could be considered Margaret Thatcher's, Ronald Reagan's, In the US, Republicans are more new right conservatives, and they're much more prone to that way of thinking. And in the UK, we've got Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, and the more right-wing Tory parties that are currently leading the conservative debate are considered new right, where you have people like David Cameron, George Osborne, Rory Stewart, Theresa May, much more moderate in their beliefs and much more prone to believing that, David Cameron legalized gay marriage. Doesn't care, that sort of stuff. And he's much more prone to allowing the state to be involved in the economy. They're very pro NHS. They spent some money here and there, I guess. But, they're basically all I'm saying is they're much more moderate than new right conservatives. And you're really seeing this in the current political debate between both Trump in the US and the conservative election here, that there's varying degrees of conservatism within conservatism. And that's causing conflict even with people who are in the same belief system. It's crazy.
Yeah. So that confuses me. Why do they call it new right when that sounds very much old right to me?
It's all about branding, I believe. It's like you call it neoliberalism, right?
Yeah,
it's new
you've got to
liberalism.
explain to me what the hell that means.
I have no idea, if I'm completely honest with you, Jack. I imagine well, it's like in economics, we have neoclassical synthesis. And it's like you have neo-Nazism. It's just a way of reframing an ideology to fit the needs of the current day, I guess, and to fit the current political issues.
Would neoliberalism be more like libertarianism now, or social liberalism, would you say? Which side is it? I'm going to assume the libertarian.
I would imagine it's more libertarian. If someone says they're a neoliberal, I always presume that means more classical liberal libertarian. But again, this is why it gets so confusing, because you can sort of make a term fit any definition, can't you?
Yeah. It's not fantastic to have this terminology that no one seems to understand, even the ones who look into it fairly deeply.
And I can't lie. I've spent a decent part of my week looking into all of this. So this sort of leads us on quite nicely